My name's Tony Lovett. I'm part of the Gooditch man and part of the Lovett family. It's a strong family name throughout Ballarat and the Western District, and originating out of the great southwest part of Victoria, down at Lake Conda and so forth. My family's always been in Ballarat since my parents moved up here in the early 60s. I guess growing up in Wendouree West, like there was our family and the Muir family were just down the road, and the Alberts family were behind us, and the Blackwell family were down there, and Auntie Di's family wasn't that far away. Uncle Ted was just around the other corner and stuff. And so there was, within a 4-block radius, there was all these different Aboriginal families that we tended to all congregate or get together. Our parents would get together. Like I recall going to watch some dances from the top end in Auntie Myrtle's lounge room, and so those conversations that happened in the lounge room and in the community, and with people knocking on her door or on Uncle Ted's door, like seeking help, and even with my parents, people coming up looking for help. That obviously there was a need there for someone to do something, and a collective service that was developed by as the Aboriginal Co-op. So those early memories were always of people being around, and that the kitchen lounge room setting was probably the key to it. I even recall, like at the opening of the Aya Street building in '82, we had a one-day football carnival as well, but on the Saturday night, No Fixed Address came down and played at the cabaret, and it was absolutely huge. And at our house, our 3-bedroom house in Wendouree, we had something like 80 people staying, and my nan slept on the couch, but refused to take bedding or take a bed from anyone and stuff, and because she wanted to watch the little ones that were there. And my older sister was babysitting at the time, and remember her telling about when Maurice Rioli come and dropped his kids off for babysitting. They're all gobsmacked then. So those sort of things, and they're the memories. Like it was just people everywhere and so forth. And I think that was sort of a prelude for us, for Mum and Dad to then move into running the Aboriginal hostel. So they were the first managers of the Ronald Cameron Hostel. And as I said, they probably had that prelude of the setting up with everyone staying at our house. I don't know if Larry and John told you the story that they actually came and lived with us when they first moved to Ballarat, and so actually changed John's coonie nappies, and so I'd like to think I've had a bit of an influence on his life, but certainly his father, Larry, was it was one of those things to have him move up from Hayward with Annie and Stacey and John and come and stay with us for a while. Once again, it was just what we did. Family just got together and family stayed together and so forth. And so, as I said, for Mum and Dad then to move into a hostel just seemed like a natural progression for us, and all of a sudden we weren't sharing our parents with just other kids. We were sharing them with other families, and to see the growth in people within that come through the hostel. So many different people come through that hostel. Once the platform for families to come together, like people who needed somewhere to stay came in there, students who were moving into Ballarat for study. And then they got this guidance from Mum and from Dad and from the other managers that worked there, and support from the other families. The food was shocking, and no, it was, the food. People will tell you they absolutely. They went to the hostel and no one ever complained about the lack of food, and that Mum's cooking was famous throughout the district, and throughout, people would book meetings in Ballarat purely just to get Mum's catering and a sponge cake and that. But the hostel was great for the family settings, but also people moving through. I remember Auntie Marge Tucker coming to stay there at a time, and just being in her presence, of such an esteemed leader within our community, and that she was there she was there in our house and or in our hostel, but just once again the family connections, the build up of everyone there. Those stories. I remember watching a young mum get placed in the hostel or had to stay there, and she had a worker that was was trying to help the mum get settled, and it was when my mum, as the manager, and sat down with this young girl and said, well, this is what you actually need to do. And she learnt more from my mum in a week than she had of 3 weeks of a social worker engagement and stuff. And then we watched that young mum then blossom into, to move out of the hostel, to be independent on her own, and coincidentally her children weren't in contact with the department again. It's just those little interventions that just meant so much. I'm sure you've probably heard the story of the fellow in Ballarat who had the prem baby, and he was left to look after his kids on his own, and he'll credit, someone like Calvin will credit mum with helping him, support him to get him where he is today, and he's great, once again, another leader within our community. So just all those stories. Like, we used to have lunches, community lunches down at the hostel, or a casserole lunch where people had just come in, and once again, just that gathering, yarning, having something to eat, and all the mob just getting together. And we didn't have social networks in those days. Well, social networks were actually those. They were purely physical social networks, and people got together and they shared information, they talked and supported each other. And so there was a real sense of community. And I guess that was one of the beauties of the Aya Street building as well for the co-op, was the kitchen. The kitchen part was where most of the business took place, because that's where you sat at the kitchen, you had a cuppa, it was in that relaxed atmosphere, and then the health workers in particular were then able to connect with the community and work out what's wrong, and they probably got more out of that than a clinical assessment behind closed doors to some degree. So it was pretty good, and just once again to see the people that had come through the hostel, like throughout the years, and they all credit mum and dad with helping them along their way and helping them with their journey. And I still get asked around my travels around the state and even around the country of how my parents are going, and people share their stories about their time at the Ronald Cameron Hostel. So, rule number 13 it was one of the rules. It was and if you'd stayed at the hostel, you remember what rule 13 was, and it's the rule that probably got broken the most. No. It's not for publication, though. Like I said, I remember it like once those family gatherings, or just the community gatherings within Auntie Myrtle's home, and just what went on there, and once again the gatherings in our home and Uncle Ted's, and then to see the development. Like Aya Street to me was sort of the big beginning of it. I've got vague recollections of Doveton Street and Bath Lane, but for me it was Aya Street was it to be around when the opening was happening there. At the same time, the hostel was just down the corner. It was on the corner of Dawson and Aya Street at that stage, and so to watch the opening of the co-op, to see Uncle Phil Cooper came down, was the CEO at the time, and incidentally, when I was in about year 9, I was asked in a careers day what I wanted to be, and I actually said I wanted to be the CEO of the Aboriginal Co-op, and a bit of hero worshipping with Uncle Phil and the work that he did at the Aboriginal Co-op, and to this day I work with him today. At Vaxel, I've been at Vaxel for 11 years now, but I first started there in '89. But it was, I worked at the legal service with Uncle Phil, and I've moved across to Vaxel with Uncle Phil, and it was just that lasting impression that he left on me, that legacy that he had about his leadership and his leadership, but also that community connection, that it was about community and control. In particular, as a young fella, I may have missed some schooling to take on more important issues, like sitting in the cultural room at Aya Street and learning more about culture from John Morris and Rexy Morgan and Lindsay Saunders and Val Heap and Arnie Glenda Blackhall, and those sort of people with a cultural team. And they were, for me, they were the people that I was going to learn from within there. Even cousin David Lovett, that as part of that team, that people that just shared stuff. And there was a young Karen Heap was the secretary there or admin within that cultural team. But together, like, it was just, they shared information. They taught us about, and we had the opportunities to learn about Aboriginal culture, about artefacts, and about where we were from, and gave us a real sense of connection and stuff. I guess the other part that was really big out of Aya Street too was the Koori Youth Group, or the Aboriginal Youth Group at the time. And just our youth group back in the day was, so it was Glenda Blackall had actually, as the Koori educator in the schools, had started getting the Aboriginal kids together to meet after school, and we'd go to the co-op. We actually formed a committee. And it was that we also were responsible to the board. So we met with, we elected our own committee. We paid 20 cents or 50 cents a week into the tin, and the treasurer kept records on that. And we did fundraisers. But once again, it was just that sense of a group getting together, of sharing that cultural knowledge and kinship knowledge just through that connectedness. And I think as either 82, I think it was, or 83, we planned a trip to Uluru. There was and part of it we went to stay at the Maryvale station, which I'm remiss of me to forget the language name of it at the moment. But we went to stay there, and because there was a lady living here in Ballarat that was from that mob, from that area, and so we planned this trip, and so we raised our own money to go there. But as part of the fundraising, I had to go into the co-op and sit down with Bill Bellings at the time, and Bill also worked at the co-op, and Bill was one of these amazing people that just had knowledge and talent to burn like an academic. Academically, his mind was there as a high achieving academic without actually going through the throes of university and so forth. And he was, and there's a great connection there with the story of Bill. But he was at the co-op, and so I had to sit down with Bill and Auntie Molly Dyer and write a submission. As a 13-year-old sitting at the typewriter in the reception of the co-op, writing a submission for us to get money to go to Uluru. And the result was that we got our funding, as well as the money that we'd raised through wake-a-thons and dance-a-thons and that sort of stuff, that we loaded up a bus and off we went up to Uluru. And for those that went along would remember that Rex Morgan you could gauge every inch of that highway through Rex Morgan's photos. So, yeah, so the opportunity was to visit Uluru as a group, but we also stayed out on Maryvale Station for a couple of days. And it was interesting because it was the biggest school attendance for the year, with the kids wanting to come to the school because we were all camped on the school lawns. So everyone from the communities, all the kids come in to go to school that week just to see who we were, but to learn, engage with the local community and learn a bit about Central Australian Aboriginal culture and communities. But once again, just that bonding of the Aboriginal young people that went on that particular trip, that it was a life-changing experience for quite a lot of us. But for me, the memory also of that, of how we got there, of sitting down with Bill and Auntie Molly and having to present to the board around what we were doing and talking to Uncle Phil about the trip and so forth. And so it was certainly stuff that gave me a grounding in my pursuits, to continue working within the Aboriginal community. Without digressing too much, the story, Bill Belling's story was an absolute amazing one, in that my older sister, and my family connection is that every single one so I've got two older sisters and a younger brother. So mum and dad, so mum was obviously she was a health worker, and then she became the hostel manager, and dad was the gardener at Aya Street, and then became the assistant manager of the hostel. And my two older sisters and my younger brother, we've all worked at Baddack. And so that's when it comes to family connections, we all work there, and now my brother's kids are working here as well now, and both he and I had a small time on the board. Obviously, I was a CEO for a short time. Now he's on the board, and mum was on the board for a while. So it's that whole family connection. And my oldest sister had moved away from Ballarat for a while, and she moved back into Ballarat, but she was actually sharing a house with an Aboriginal woman called Susie. And what happened is that when they were there, Susie had found that she'd been adopted out as a young girl from her family. At the same time, Auntie Noreen Morgan was one of the health workers that we had here at the co-op. and she was here for a year or so, a couple of years. But then she took up a job opportunity in Melbourne, and her youngest son at the time, Brando, had settled in Ballarat so much that he actually moved in with us as a family. So he came and lived with us. And then Suzanne had moved back to Ballarat and was renting a house in Ballarat and living with Susie. And then Susie had found out that she had an older brother, that when she was taken from her family, there was her and two other brothers. So anyway, she went to, this day was arriving when her brother was coming to visit. She was coming to meet her brother for the first time. And there was a knock on the door, and she said, I can't do it. And she asked Suzanne, my sister, oldest Suzanne, to answer the door. So Suzanne answers the door. And standing at the door is Bill Bellings. And Suzanne goes, oh, Bill, what are you doing here? He said, I've come to meet my sister. And she went, oh my God, you're Susie's sister. And it worked out that Bill Bellings had looked after Suzanne when she lived in Melbourne, as being that older brother for her within Melbourne, and really looked after her. And so here she was living with her sister. The mother that they'd been removed from was Auntie Noreen. And so we had Brando living with us, and Suzanne was living with his sister Sue, and the older brother Bill had come down. That was just absolutely freakish about what it is. And think of other stories. I know, like you would have heard stories of Ballarat being, a lot of people from stolen generations, or people that were removed from their families, or those who the parents couldn't look after them, and they gave the children up for adoption. So yeah, in '98, I realised that Year 9 dream, or nightmare, whichever way you want to look at it, about becoming the CEO of the Aboriginal Co-op. And it was an opportune time, I think, in that, if you recall, in those late 90s is when the Prime Minister of the time decided that Aboriginal program funding needed to be slashed across the board, and we'll take out all of those funds that support local Aboriginal organisations such as BADAC. So administrative, we lost all this core funding. So there wasn't a lot of money around for people like to have administration and stuff. So BADAC sort of did what they could do and scraped together some funds, and they had a little bit of money to come up with a 20-hour-a-week position. I'd been on contracts in the Department of Human Services at the time. I'd worked at the Aboriginal Legal Service for a few years, and then I had an opportunity to work in government, and it was really good, because one of the things I learnt, particularly working in the Aboriginal Legal Service, is when we sat down and talked to government, they spoke a different language. And I didn't really understand it. So to get in there and work within government for a few years and understand their language, to be able to then, I guess, be a conduit between community and government, contract at the department, or I'll try my hand here. And it was just something coming in, there wasn't a great deal of money there. There's some great passion within the organisation. There's some fantastic people that were working here and had worked here for a long time. And the board was people, my peers, my elders within the community that I'd grown up knowing. Didn't mean that we always got along or seen eye to eye. And there's certainly some challenging times, but I said I committed 3 years to have a look, and I think it was good for the community, or for the organisation, to settle a little bit and say, well, what are we doing? Because, as I said, it had been a tumultuous time. We'd had the guts ripped out of us in terms of our core funding, but they could take away the funding, but they just couldn't take away our values and our principles. And so it was about just trying to consolidate all of that. And I got a praise from a friend from Melbourne, come up for a meeting one day, and when they come in, they said, oh, I just can't believe the sense of how happy people are here, or just that sense of community when you walk in the door. And once again, the shape of this building was a little bit different, but and back then we had far less security issues to be concerned about. But people could walk in at any door and go into any part of the building and connect with people. But they were met with smiles at reception, and there was a table there where you could sit down and make a cuppa, and Auntie Kath could possibly be there, or Uncle Ted was around, or Uncle Frank, or the people, or there was kids in the playgroup area that were playing. So people would come in and they just get that sense straight away that there's community, and there's a vibrant community there. And so it was something that was always it was quite good to be a part of. The other thing that was happening at the time is the department were trying to roll out a courier services improvement strategy as a state government department. It didn't work anywhere else in the state. But it worked here, and mainly because we embraced it and said, and that's nothing, no disrespect to any other community around the state, but it was about saying, well, it's about our community, government and mainstream agencies all working together. And it can't work with just two partners out of the three, it's got to be all three. And Merv Atkinson was a big part of driving that as well, and so he played a strong part in that. And I guess for me, that was part of my achievements here at Baddock. I think it was just consolidating what we'd had, trying to look into the future a little bit, but not too far. I never would have envisaged what the organisation is today, and so forth, but I think it stands as a testament to self-determination and what an Aboriginal organisation, what an Aboriginal community can achieve. And part of my work, I'm also involved with Aboriginal Justice through the Regional Aboriginal Justice Advisory Committee. And in developing AJA4, we looked at self-determination, and I said, could you imagine an Aboriginal self-determined justice system? And if you can't, just think back to 40 years ago in the 70s when the Co-op had a white, a non-Aboriginal nurse that started in Ballarat and drove up through Ararat, Halls Gap, Stawell, Horsham, down to Hamilton, Portland, Hayward, Lake Condah, Framlingham, Warrnambool, Geelong, and then come back and did it all again the next week or the week after that, or those things. But now, and then that was what our Aboriginal medical services used to look like. And then fast forward into 2020, and we have Aboriginal qualified health workers running an Aboriginal medical service. We have Aboriginal childcare agencies, or Aboriginal childcare facilities. We're doing our own thing. So I've continually used Baddock as that model that I talk about when saying, well, self-determination is achievable. Community control is quite achievable, because here's something that's already happened, here's what's done. And we're not alone, like our other community organisations have followed a similar path, but credit where credit's due is that Baddock started paving the way. In the 70s, Aboriginal people were looking for help, looking for assistance, and those community people, Auntie Di, Richard Kennedy, Uncle Teddy, Auntie Myrtle, were there to help people, and collectively they then formed the Aboriginal Co-op, and we're where we are today. Because of their vision at that time, and certainly because of the continued work of the Co-op today, and the staff and the board, and their vision and their growth for where we're going. So our young people have got that, they've got a great legacy to build on, and there are some fantastic role models within this community, and developing role models and stuff. And it's not pick on John Kanoa Day, but John started in CDEP with me out at Main Road, which is a work for the dole type of program. And to have the opportunities that he's been provided, he's had to work for them. But he comes from a great grounding of his father and the community that he's had to work in and been able to work in. And he's worked through a few jobs and picked up various skills and knowledge as he went. But in terms of looking towards the future, there's our future leaders there, and his children are going to learn from him, and the cycle will continue.